The subject I chose after being invited to deliver this oldest of all formal lectures at Harvard University was a theme which has been very much on my mind the last few years, and I entitled it, "In the Beginning Was Consciousness." This may sound a somewhat strange title, but I chose this on purpose. I believe that we are at the present moment at the cusp of the curve of life, what the French call courbe de vie, of the paradigm which has dominated Western civilization since the Renaissance. And this transformation that is coming about has at its heart this question, as we shall find out very soon. It was about 50 years ago, right on this campus, when with Thomas Kuhn, who died recently, unfortunately, before finishing his work, a major American philosopher of science, as many of you know, and a few others were struggling and grappling and wrestling with this question of paradigm shifts. He and I did not exactly agree on what it was, but we both felt that there's a major change that is afoot. And of course, these things do not come so quickly, as he himself pointed out. It is very important writings. It takes some time. But I do believe that it is a time that the most important questions that face present-day civilization will involve not only solutions within the present parameters within which we think, but those parameters themselves, that is, the paradigm within which human beings carry out their intellectual and also practical activities. So in the beginning was consciousness. And the original title of my talk was not only "In the beginning was consciousness," but "In the beginning is consciousness." Because this "in the beginning" is not simply a past time. It involves a principial reality. Let me begin by quoting from several of the sacred scriptures of the world. In the Rig Veda, the oldest of all Hindu sacred scriptures, we read, "One alone is the dawn, beaming over all this. It is the one that severally becomes all this. The one who is Sit, Sat, Chit, and Ananda, that is, both, all three being blessed, state of being blessed, or in state of bliss, and of course consciousness, Chit." Same in the Tao Te Ching, the primary text of Taoism, and also its influence upon Neo-Confucianism, of course, we all know. "The nameless Tao is the beginning of heaven and earth. The name Tao is the mother of 10,000 things." So at the origin you have the Tao, which in fact is consciousness. I'll come to consciousness in a moment. And of course we all know the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In chapter 6 of the book of John, Christ said that my word is spirit and life. So this word is not simply word in the ordinary sense, but it's spirit and life. And finally in the Quran, in chapter 36 of Surah Yasin, "But his command, when he intendeth a thing, is only that he saith unto it, be, and it is. Kun fayakun." And so the origin is very explicitly stated in the Quran to be the command of God, which is itself, as the word Amr, A-M-R, is considered to be on the level of what we call logos in the logos theories of theology and philosophy, logos doctrines. Now, when we turn to traditional philosophies all over the world, we see this almost remarkable unanimity. We think of the zero, of the lambda, of Pythagoras. We think of the to agathon, of Plato, Aristotle's divine intellect. We think of the essay of St. Thomas Aquinas, with a capital E, of course, which is also consciousness, which knows the divine being, and its correspondence, of course, in Islamic philosophy, to which St. Thomas Aquinas was so close. And outside of the circle of Western Asia and Europe, in the Abrahamic world, of course, we think of Atman in Advaita Vedanta and Hindu metaphysics, which is pure consciousness, the self, which is the origin of all things, and also the role of the Tao in the Neo-Confucian philosophies of the 12th, 13th century. You can go on and on and on. So where's the exception? The exception really is to be found in the world in which we happen to be living. Before modern times, there were philosophies for which consciousness was not primary and in the beginning. We see it in the Greco-Roman antiquity, we see it in certain schools of Hinduism, but they're really minor. They do not dominate over the vision, over the world view, the Weltanschauung of the civilizations in question. And in all of these civilizations, there was a mentality in which in the beginning did not imply only a beginning in time somewhere back there. We shall come back to that. It's very important. It's very significant that in English we say in the beginning was the word. In the Vulgate it says in principia erat verbum. So in the principia, in principle, was the word, and not only temporally. And these other civilizations were all very, very fully aware of this. Now, the reality of the primacy of consciousness begins in modern times at the end of the Renaissance, especially with the scientific revolution. Before I turn to that, it's very important, if we're going to be philosophically serious, of course, to define what we mean by consciousness. Those people who believe that philosophy should only deal with what is operationally definable, that is making philosophy a handmaid of physics and engineering, of course, there's certain concepts with which they do not deal. Namely, what's behind me, the word veritas, which should be taken off, if not put in the philosophy department, because that cannot be defined from the point of operational methods that is used in analytical philosophy. But the universal concept of philosophy is to that which I'm appealing, and the traditional understanding of philosophy, which also is very rigorous, but not necessarily operational, because it's impossible to define consciousness operationally. Every time you try to define consciousness operationally, you have to make use of consciousness in order to do so. It's like the famous saying of Pascal that you cannot define to be, because every time you use a sentence, you say c'est, that is, it is. And you're already using the verb to be in order to define it. So, of course, then you have a circular argument, and that's not acceptable. Now, it's a paradox that something as obvious as consciousness cannot be externally and operationally defined. That is true. But we all know what consciousness is, even if through some kind of solipsism, or at least a kind of inward way of deluding ourselves of being the only reality, we might deny the world out there, or through some kind of sophism try to deny the reality of consciousness. We do so in both cases through the use of consciousness. Consciousness is the most primary reality with which we judge every other reality. Consciousness for these traditional civilizations, for religions and philosophies, was not a state, it was a substance. It was not a process. It was something that was, like being itself, which was at once luminous and numinous, at once knowing and knowing that it's knowing, knowledgeable of its own knowledge, at once the source of all sentience, of all experience, and beyond experience by having knowledge that is experiencing something. That is why even the most skeptical philosophers had a great deal of trouble negating it, even those who were skeptics from a religious point of view. We have the supreme example of that, of skepticism, of course, in the famous Cartesian method. Descartes was, I think, wrong in many ways, but he was right in one thing, and that is that if you doubt everything, you cannot doubt the fact that you're doubting. And it's from this comes, of course, the famous cogito ergo sum, the cogito of Descartes, that is, I think, therefore I am. The therefore is unfortunate because the therefore has other consequences. Descartes should have said, I think, therefore God is, but he forgot that. But nevertheless, the fact that if you negate everything, if you doubt everything, you cannot doubt the instrument with which you're doubting. And if you think this begins with Descartes, the great Persian philosopher Ibn Sina, Avicenna, over 1,000 years ago, talks about the hanging man, al-insan al-mu'allaqa. That is a man hung in the middle of space. So his feet do not touch anything, his hands do not touch anything, he doesn't know where he is, he can doubt the existence of the earth, he can doubt the existence of the air, there's nothing that he can not doubt. The only thing he cannot doubt is himself that is doubting other things. So in fact, Descartes' argument is not the beginning of it in the history of philosophy. There have been other instances. Anyway, even the skeptical philosophers in days of old did not deny the primacy of consciousness. The question was, what mode of consciousness, what kind of consciousness? But I don't want to spend my whole lecture just defining consciousness. I want to get back to the significance of it metaphysically and its loss for our life, religiously and otherwise. Now, as I said, I believe that it was really at the beginning of the scientific revolution that in the beginning was consciousness was seriously challenged. At first, it was not challenged outwardly by those who were the great masters who created modern science, especially certainly not by Johannes Kepler and Sir Isaac Newton, both of whom had even a mystical aspect of religion, and they believed not only in God, but they believed in a kind of mystical vision of God, each in his own way. And even Galileo the Maverick, he could not even imagine denying that God created the world. That was not in the point of discussion. But once having set up this world view in which God becomes only the creator of the world, two things set in. First of all, the levels of consciousness are all, in a sense, reduced to a single level. That is, the multi-leveled structure of the world of consciousness, which we had traditionally, from divine consciousness to the consciousness of the angels, of the great intellects, of the great saints and sages, all the way to our consciousness of ordinary human beings, that was all reduced to a single level of reality. And people spoke of consciousness as being ordinary human consciousness. The second consequence, which is even more devastating from the point of our discussion here, was that it was accepted that God created the world, and of course God had consciousness because he knew, he's the knower, and he had all the other attributes which we attribute to consciousness. But after that had nothing to do with it. That is the deistic position which came to the fore for a long time and gradually replaced the theistic position after Paley and others. Natural theism sort of went out of the window in England, and many of these lectures on natural theology had trouble in the late 19th century, early 20th century, on this very issue. Natural theology was considered to be, in fact, an oxymoron, not having any real significance and meaning. So that theism was a very temporary matter. What lasted much longer was a deism, within which it still functioned to a large extent. During the last 40 years, we keep talking about the Big Bang Theory, Big Bang Theory, Big Bang Theory. There have been lectures even held on how that is related to perhaps to the fiat lux of the book of Genesis, or قَالَ اللَّهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونُ of the Quran, and the Abrahamic world of seeing a creator God create the world suddenly, and this is very theological. But the consciousness of God is irrelevant to this, because once the Big Bang has taken place and the universe is there, we are not interested in any consciousness in the universe. There's no such thing. It is always energies and material particles. So consciousness is taken out of God's creation. And that is what takes place in the 17th century. And it becomes an epiphenomenon in the human state, to which I shall turn in a moment. It is with the help of this mechanical view of the universe, complemented by the Darwinian theory of evolution in the 19th century, that essentially the category of consciousness becomes irrelevant in human life. It becomes irrelevant even if we believe that God created the heavens and the earth. For everyday life, is, in a sense, it's so what? As far as the sciences, as our attitude towards things, our situation in the world is concerned, if we accept that scientific point of view. And it is this which led finally to the idea of always trying to explain by reduction. I mean, that's one of the most important characteristics of modern thought. Explanation through analysis, but not through synthesis. That is, the whole is never greater than its parts, and therefore we are always after ultimate particles. When I was a physics student at MIT, they thought that within 5 years we'll discover all the ultimate particles of matter. I mean, the Nobel Prize winning physicist. 50 years later, we're still looking for ultimate particles, and we'll be running, and then particles will be running, and we'll never catch up to them. Because of a metaphysical reason, there's not just a few billiard balls that just happen to be very small, and we just haven't found the little ones in the corner and put them up together, and we create the universe. But we have this idea. As soon as we go to a doctor's office, that's what's at play. We are reduced to what the MRI says on the board. And the rest of us doesn't count, and whatever is not on the MRI. And that is reduced to the biology, biology to the chemistry, chemistry to the physics, and so forth and so on. This reductionism, which then takes hold, and in which, in fact, if you even talk about consciousness, it is irrelevant as far as I said, this, even science of the body is concerned. It's only now that Harvard University has started a spirituality and healing program at the medical school 6-7 years ago, because we only know too well how our consciousness does affect our body in remarkable ways. But it's not supposed to. We cannot explain it according to the model, the prevalent model that is around. And we finally end up at the tail end, where we enter into the realm of quantum mechanics, in which, again, paradoxically, we have to accept consciousness, because we cannot never know anything without observing it. And the question that psychons, that some of you may have heard of, and physicists have spoken of course most physicists have not accepted, that we have psychic particles, that is consciousness particles, along with neurons and so forth, and neutrons and all the other things that are around. That is itself is a way of trying to come to terms. So we end up with this paradox that we cannot really understand the universe quantum mechanically without a consciousness to observe the events, and what makes the vector collapse, the state vector collapse, which is a very important philosophical issue, whether it's us as the observer or God as the creator. That a lot of debate has taken place. But anyway, the element of consciousness has grabbed us by the neck and won't let us go. And then the remarkable thing is that when we come to the end of this period of the gradual dissolution of this Renaissance 17th century paradigm, the other extreme enters into Western society. For example, Hinduism is at the antipode of this 17th century view, in which everything has consciousness. The stone's being is a form of stony consciousness, if I can use such an English term. But in Hinduism, that would be perfectly understandable. In our terms, it's not understandable. And up the line, all the way to human beings, and it's not parapsychism. That's quite something else. But you also so you have the Hindu doctrines, other ideas coming from the East, and then you have all the occultism and the pseudo sort of religious elements which talk about panpsychism and all kinds of things coming into that very world, which had negated the reality of consciousness from everything in the world except the human beings. And perhaps God. If you believe in God, whether you believe or not, it was irrelevant to our situation in the world as far as the world around us was concerned. Now, this banishing of consciousness from the cosmos, denying that in the beginning was consciousness and also in principle is consciousness at the present moment, has had very deep consequences, I believe, for the human state, for what we are suffering through, what we're going through today. And I thought that it would be important to say a few words about it. Let's not forget that we don't want to accept this, but the scientific theory is that consciousness is an epiphenomenon in the cosmos, possessed by very irrelevant people on a very irrelevant planet in a very irrelevant galaxy who happen to know all of these things, to say that they're all irrelevant. But that part nobody talks about. That second part nobody talks about. So it's not really considered to be a major reality in the cosmos. In fact, it's not even a minor reality. It's practically not there. We have a cosmos which is not only dead, but without consciousness. And nevertheless, consciousness studies it in a particular mode of consciousness that we have. Now, what are the consequences of this? First and foremost was the withering of religious life by reducing levels of consciousness to the lowest and the most ordinary. I believe one of the reasons for the withering of mysticism within Western Christianity, not only Protestant Christianity, but to some extent Catholic Christianity, was this loss of the vision of levels of consciousness. In medieval times, or even in the Renaissance, Teresa Avila had visions of Christ and so forth and so on. That meant something within that universe. Whereas when Swedenborg was having his visions in Stockholm with the Swedenborgian church down the street, that didn't mean anything in the scientific culture of that time. And so the position of Swedenborg's vision in the Christianity of the 18th century is very different from that of St. Teresa of Avila in the Catholicism of the 16th century. And so it had a very important effect upon religious life. And also it had a very important effect, of course, upon cutting off man's consciousness from the higher levels of consciousness, which did not go away by our denying them. That is taking away the ladder. If you say there's no third floor in this building, you'll not try to go up to the third floor. And therefore, the quest for transcendence, for the empowering, you might say, and illuminating of our consciousness, which was always the goal of all traditional civilizations, became irrelevant. Our desire for perfection became horizontalized, gaining more and more information, but not necessarily luminous knowledge, which means a transformation of one's consciousness. Another consequence of this was the realities of religion became lost. They became either meaningless or reduced to metaphors or simply historical accidents and so forth and so on. It's not accidental that all of these philosophies of religion that developed from the 19th century onward are either based on historical reductionism of reducing historical realities to what can be understood materially and denying everything which cannot be proven in a laboratory at Oxford or Harvard. Since we cannot walk on water, Christ could not have walked on water, certainly. And therefore, if people say he did walk on water, either they were blind or they had been as well educated as us, or he has some other meaning. So the whole question of the language of religion, the way it spoke to humanity, from the greatest miracles, the founders of religion, to everyday religious life, of course, became unreal. The turning away in droves of people from religion in the 18th and 19th century is not at all accidental. That is, religion addresses the humanity in a universe which is full of consciousness. Not only is the divine reality consciousness, you have hierarchy of angels, of various conscious beings, now reduced to UFOs. I shall come to them in just a moment. Or in the non-Abrahamic world, let's say in the Buddhist Tibetan tradition, of all of the hierarchy of the various Buddhas and Avalokiteshvaras and all kinds of beings, intermediate worlds, the world of Hinduism, all the gods and goddesses, and you can just go down the line. There's no religion in which the universe is not filled with consciousness. Even with these most rationalistic Muslims who try to interpret Islam in a very dry and rationalistic manner, they cannot deny the reality of the Archangel Gabriel, without which there would not have been a Quranic revelation. They cannot deny the verse of the Quran in which this is written. But this became a very, very important issue that, in a sense, reduced the understanding of the language of religion and caused this panic among many people, this fervor to try to reinterpret it, all the way from atheists to theists, from Karl Marx to Schleiermacher in the 19th century and in the 20th century, all different kinds of interpretations of something which people did not have to explain in the old days because it was part of their general worldview. It was part of the universe. God could speak to the trees as well as to us. Angelic beings could manifest themselves. They could bring knowledge. Consciousness was not limited, of course, to the human order. And it even affected the relationship between the human being and God. And it's true that these events did not destroy the reality of God in the minds of many people. But it did affect that relationship. Even the question of prayer and the efficacy of prayer. How does God answer prayer? Of course, in a mechanistic universe in which consciousness is put at the beginning in time, this is a very difficult thing to explain rationally. What are the agencies through which the divine can come into our lives? And so it had to be done through emotions. Most theologians in the West try to explain this emotionally without really confronting intellectually, in the most rigorous sense, the challenge of the mechanistic universe. They try to circumvent it. And of course, Christian theology suffered a great deal in the battles that were fought, because you had to accept more and more a scientific point of view. Even today, we have all of this movement for better relation between religion and science, started by the Templeton Foundation. I was their advisor for several years, but I don't have time now. I withdraw myself. But it's always the theologians have to give. The science have never to give anything. It's always theology that is retreating step by step, and therefore left, of course, a deep imprint upon theological concerns, one of which we now pay for a great deal, and that is the lack of attention to nature as a theological category. which left Christianity in the 17th century and has only come back in our own time. So I'm going to come back in a moment. Another important consequence of that is really the loss of the meaning of being human. What does it mean to be human? I don't think this is just an academic matter. Of course, we would say someone who has an immortal soul, for a Christian. Again, we come back, we have consciousness of only being human, of having human soul, and God having being the Spirit with a capital S, and that's it. What about being human towards the rest of God's creation? What does that entail? What does that mean? Leaving out the animal and plant realms. And then also within the human being, what is the relationship between our being human as an immortal soul and the rest of our body? The indifference to the body as a source of wisdom, which came about, and a sudden rediscovery in the 1960s through sexuality and loud music and all kinds of things of trying to reassert the reality of the body, was a reaction really to this, which goes back precisely to what happened with this loss of the sense of the presence of consciousness throughout reality. More difficult than that was that not only was the sense of the sacredness of human life put into question, because the word sacred doesn't mean anything in the context of modern science, it's just pure sentimentality, but what happened was that human beings lost their home. That is, we became homeless in the cosmos. Every traditional humanity felt had a position in the universe. And don't know how childish it was that you had this Ptolemaic system with the earth in the middle and all of the heavens above, how a sense of pride that we were in the middle of things. It was not a sense of pride, we were also the lowest point of things. But at least Dante knew where he was. But for better or for worse, he knew where he was. And the Mesoamericans, whom Professor Sullivan studies in the Amazon, they feel they know where they are. We don't know where we are. I mean, we do not have a home in the cosmos. There's a very profound sense of alienation. And that is what has brought into the English language the word alien, in the new sense. Not only has it brought psychological alienation, which is one of the maladies of the modern world, from which traditional societies suffered much less. Much less. Alienation is one of our, like AIDS, is a really modern ailment. Not that no one was ever alienated before, but this strong sense of alienation, to a large extent, comes from the fact that if we think this through and accept this reductionist worldview that came in the 17th century, cutting off consciousness from the world in which we live, we are very lonely here. We are alienated in this cosmos. The cosmos is not a hospitable place for us. And of course, if we sit down and calculate what are the probabilities of our being here, and it comes out to be extremely, extremely, extremely small, then that makes it even stranger. But we won't get into all those discussions. As you know, that the possibility of one cell being just created by accident, as they've said, is like a monkey banging on, at that time there were typewriters, now it's computers, and producing Hamlet. It's about the same, producing one of the Shakespearean plays. But even if that happened, and we try to put that in a corner of our mind, we feel that we don't belong here if we take this seriously. That's why we don't take it seriously. Any person who walks in the street and smells a flower, saw how beautiful, that person is not taking this point of view seriously, even if he's a professor teaching it at class. Because our human psyche, in order to remain sane, has to feel at home somewhat. And this has nothing to do with the mystical alienation, which a lot of these people writing on the environment today have confused the two. Mystical alienation from the world is to realize that our home is ultimately paradise, is the angelic world. And we are on a journey here. This is not a permanent home. We are on a journey here. That's very different from feeling that, in fact, this has nothing to do with us. We don't belong here. A very different sense. And the two should not be confused. It's as if you come to Harvard University for 4 years as a freshman until senior. Now, this is not your permanent home. But nevertheless, you feel you belong to Harvard. These years are spent here. They're creative, and you try to take care of your dorm. To some extent, if you're a boy student, women student, somewhat neater. But anyway, you're living in here for a few years. You don't want to live in a garbage can. Whereas that's not the way how modern man feels. The world around us, from which we're alienated, also becomes worthless in a sense. And therefore, our value only as far as our own immediate impulses and so-called needs, which are really usually mostly pseudo-needs, are concerned with the catastrophe that it brings about with the world of nature. And now I want to turn to this point. The consequences of the alienation from the world and this loss of vision of consciousness as being, in a sense, omnipresent throughout creation, most of all, of course, is in the relation that has been created between modern man and nature, modern men and women. I wish it were true that only men are ruin the environment, the women save the environment. They should be made the head of every company in the United States immediately and solve the problem. But unfortunately, the issue is much more complicated than that. But I'm using the word man here in the older sense of the term, not male. But in the human being and the environment. This issue, of course, is now very much in the center of our attention. I remember that right in this library, in the early 60s, I spent the summer when I was teaching here at Harvard, doing research on the book that came out as Man and Nature, the Rockefeller Series Lectures, which I delivered the year after at the University of Chicago, which is still in print, like the three Muslim sages. We sort of foretold the environmental crisis. None of the theologians, either here, some of my friends, or in England, were at all interested in what I was saying. The theology of nature was a non-existent category. Nobody was interested in this. And they said, what is all this you're talking about? And they were angry at me for even speaking about these matters. The fact that the environmental crisis has a religious, theological, spiritual basis. It's not just bad engineering, as some people think, as a deeper root. And I think that has everything to do with what we think of the world around us. I mean, what is this tree I'm looking at the window? If it's just wood for my fireplace, if the fox is just skin to put around my wife's neck, and this mountain just iron from which to draw, extract and make cars, that's a very different attitude than if I look upon these things as sharing my own reality. Let me put it in a very common, everyday sense. Like we do with our pets. I mean, none of us would accept to have a fried cat for dinner. God forbid. My cat is right now in the hospital. I've just paid $1,000 since yesterday just to get her operated. So I sympathize. I love animals. But we will never think of it, those who are animal lovers, because that animal shares in our reality. We talk to our cat even, or a horse, or a dog, and so forth. We feel they have consciousness. If we had accepted the Cartesian view, these are mechanical beings, sort of creatures, machines, we did not share in our reality, we would do with them what we've been doing with the macro nature around us, decimating it, decimating the names of, in the name of human needs, and sitting on a limb of a tree and cutting it without knowing that we're going to fall down and break our neck very soon. And the great tragedy is that now we don't even want to talk about these issues anymore. The last 2 years it's been put on the back burner, as if it were a minor issue about, let's say, how to improve the saddle of horses in Texas or something. That would have been at the top of the list if I had been there, made the wrong state, let's say Massachusetts. And we don't think about it anymore. But it's, of course, a crucial matter, which I believe is a direct consequence of our alienation from a world in which there is no participation in the same reality. Because even if you say, oh, my body is made of stardust, and I share the dust of the stars. This is all nice poetry, but it doesn't mean a darn thing. Because what consciousness do I have of my own dust, except a reality within my consciousness? And when I identify myself with a star, it has to be something that identifies with my consciousness. Otherwise, the word D-U-S-T, what the heck does it mean? It has to be something for which has meaning within my consciousness, and that's what's lacking. Now, to get to a more philosophical issue, when you negate that in the beginning was consciousness, and you end up with this idea of consciousness being an island within certain creatures known as human beings who occupy a certain planet called the Earth, how do we know? How can we know anything? The Cartesian bifurcation has never been solved, its solution. Everything we say is really not the complete solution. How do I know that something is out there? Because I cannot say that there are neurons in my brains reacting. So what? Neurons and consciousness are not the same thing. It's a very, very big jump. Very big jump. It's like the jump between the board or a canvas and the painting by Raphael on top of it. They're not the same thing. We just say this, I mean, to please ourselves. But really, how is it possible for us to know the world out there if there is no common category, nothing that unites the knower and the known? This enfeeblement of methodology, which was never a problem for traditional philosophies, nobody was really very much concerned because it was very easy to explain, has everything to do with the total and radical partition between what we call consciousness and matter. Whatever the word matter means, I don't even want to use it, but the material world, corporeal world. There's this very, very deep, categorical, absolute division between consciousness and matter. And therefore, how can one know the other? Now, we don't claim that matter knows us. We don't claim the other way. Because knowing is one of the attributes of consciousness. And since we do not attribute any power of consciousness to matter, material things, we do not say that they know. I once asked a question of one of my physics professors, I was telling my dear friend Dr. more about this the other day. This question, when I was at MIT, I said, look, we just studied integral calculus, and we learned that you can integrate the trajectory of a particular object that you throw into the air through mathematics to find out exactly what that trajectory is and where that thing will land. Now, this object, this little pebble or whatever it is that you're throwing out, obviously does not know any calculus and cannot integrate the function. How does it know exactly where to go? Why does it never miss? Why does it always go to the same place? So, oh, these are laws of nature. Don't ask about these things. They're in physics. But it really didn't answer the question. If you had the traditional understanding of nature, that's not so difficult. Supreme consciousness, in a sense, impinges through various levels of reality upon the ether, and the ether upon the elements, and the elements upon what we see out there, certain norms, certain orders, which then we observe. And so even the laws of nature, which we'll be able to observe, far from being simply subjective whims and fancies, which scientists would not accept either, they believe it to be objective, has a reason why it's subjective, and it's understandable, it's coherent from that point of view. But of course, this is something that we can no longer rely upon in the way that we think about knower and known. And this leads me to another very important point. Since we become marginalized, since consciousness has become marginalized, since we categorically deny the possibility of consciousness outside of the human domain, we're at a loss what happens when something in the human domain goes outside of this room that we have determined for it and either seeks or claims to find consciousness elsewhere. This problem never existed before. The question of UFOs, aliens, abductions. Now look, this too easy to say these are all crazy people, throw them into the asylum, that's it. All civilizations have negated and rejected people who had a worldview other than the dominant worldview of that civilization. But they didn't do it in the name of science. We do it in the name of science. We have a very famous professor here at Harvard, John Mack, who studied hundreds of cases of this, clinically, scientifically. And even if we do not accept that these people are telling the truth, this is related to something that is a kind of deep urge of connectedness with intelligence, with consciousness beyond our immediate human terrestrial sphere. And it's not accidental, it's not part and parcel of pop culture, of common culture. Children are brought up with it. Movies on aliens and so forth, science fiction. What function does this fill? What is it doing? Why is there so many people interested in these things? They've taken the place, actually, of all accounts of non-human intelligence and consciousness in traditional civilizations. And somewhere works of Tolkien and so forth and so on, the two meet together. That is, of fairy tales, of stories of angels, of various celestial beings. Every civilization was full of these, and it percolated into books read for children, stories told by grandmothers to people at the smallest age, and it satisfied the very, very deep yearning of the human soul for companionship in the world in which we live. When you cut that off, when that is no longer relevant, that becomes a fairy tale. When we say in English fairy tale, that means something that is false. A myth means something unreal rather than real. Myth was reality, now it's unreality. When we change all of these things, then we cannot act in a vacuum. In its place comes all of these things that you see. This phenomena of, first of all, science fiction itself, much of it dealing with attempt to try to fill this is a pseudo-sacred, you might say, writing. And there are all of these claims of visions, of films which sell millions and millions. Why does the child want to see some strange extraterrestrial looking very strange, touching it and so forth? And why is that person good? Why is that alien good? And so forth and so on. These are extremely profound issues which deal with the total psyche of a society which has been banned from having contact or even thinking that it's possible to have contact within a universe in which there's other form of not only life but of intelligence and of consciousness. Also, this alienation has made a sham, really, of the metaphysical and philosophical basis of ethics. This is a very big claim that I'm making, and it's really subject for another day. Some other person should talk about this, but let me just say a word about it. In all periods of human history, ethics was related to a vision of reality, had a cosmic aspect. We think of the battle of Ahriman and Ahura Mazda, Zoroastrianism. We think of the treatise of St. Augustine on the good. We think of Neo-Confucianism. You know, whatever world you go into, that's a kind of permanent condition of all serious ethics. That is, ethics was never only human ethics for human beings. It had a cosmic aspect. It had a cosmic aspect. There was a triangle, for the Abrahamic world at least. You had God, or in Hinduism, Ishvara. You had the human being, and you had the world, the cosmos. And in the world of ethics, there was a correspondence. What we have done is that through this depleting of the cosmos in which we live, of consciousness, made any ethical act towards the world of nature contrived. Vis-a-vis human beings, we say we're, let's say, Christians, we follow Christian ethics, and I've been very respectful to my neighbor, and thou shalt not kill, and so forth and so on. But why should not one cut a tree? Why should one not kill a particular animal, and so forth and so on? In the old days, in the Old and New Testament, there were explanations given for this. Animals also had souls and so forth, but that has been all gone. And any kind of environmental ethics, which is based on this atomistic or scientistic, I don't call it scientific view of the world, is based on sentimentality. It is not based on reality, if we accept that as reality. It's based on sentimentality. It's like saying sacredness of human life. With one breath, it says sacredness of human life. With the next breath, we say we're nothing but DNA. What is sacred about DNA? Just some molecules banging against each other in certain configurations. If you reject the sacred, if you reject that the imprint upon the DNA is a theological concept of the Word of God being imprinted upon DNA, which is this is meaningless, a statement in modern biology. Where does the sacredness come from? But in the human world, we can still do. But even the withering away of Christian ethics, which now we see before us after several hundred years of Christian ethics surviving in a world in which its cosmological basis was gone, is withering away has to do a lot with this. And especially when it comes to environmental ethics, which if we do not create in a serious way, we will not be able to live in the future. That's why these people, let's say, who are animal activists, people like that, they're outside of the mainstream. The mainstream cannot accept them. They're called nutty people, crazy people, people who tie themselves to trees and so on, go on top of trees, refuse to come down, and so it will not be cut down. These heroic acts performed by Greenpeace, going before big ships with the little boats and so forth and so on. This is not part of our mainstream, because we cannot develop an environmental ethics which is also in accord with the worldview which dominates over our lives. That's why there's such a disjunction for them in our hospitals. between the purely mechanical treatment of the human body and the fact that some people believe they have a soul and the human body is not just a mechanical gadget, and all of these tensions that we see, and I think that's one of the greatest challenges which the coming to end of this worldview will pose for us. Finally, if we take seriously the rejection of the idea of consciousness being not only the beginning in time but also in principle of the universe, it really shatters all the deepest hopes of human beings. First of all, the eschatological hopes, immortality, these all become dreams. And that is why we are the first time in human history, the development of a society in which the vast majority of people do not harbor these hopes. Now they're coming back. A lot of people are coming back. But in Europe, certainly, still that goes on. Great fear brings these hopes back, but it doesn't accord with the worldview. If we come from time and space, we cannot transcend time and space. There's nothing that ever existed at the omega point which was not at the alpha point. I've written very strong against Teilhard de Chardin and those kinds of theologians who believe that at the beginning was matter, at the end there will be spirit, because Christ said, I'm the alpha and the omega. He just didn't say I'm the omega. And if we do not have a root in consciousness, which is beyond time, which is atemporal, we'll never return to there. And so the deepest aspirations of human beings, which have always been for immortality in the deepest sense, that is, for an experience beyond time and space, based on the idea that we are the only beings always aware that we die. Even if we're good scientists, we know we're going to die. Not all the films we can borrow from blockbusters can prevent us from thinking of the fact that sooner or later we will die. No diversion can prevent us from that. And therefore the reality of human life, which is with the terminus quo of death and what that implies spiritually, that has, of course, been very, very strongly challenged. I believe the time has come, and with this I want to end. The time has come that we must take this challenge very, very seriously, to rethink what is consciousness in relation to our life, in relation to the life in which we live, the world in which we live, in relation to our way of knowing, our sentience, our experience, and to also realize what are the consequences of the negation of the primacy of consciousness. Although it is totally logically absurd to deny the primacy of consciousness, because as soon as we do so, we do it through consciousness. But a lot of people have done it. Many professors on this campus, behavioral psychologists and the like, of course, do not believe there is such thing as consciousness. It's logically absurd, but they do it nevertheless. But to realize what are the consequences of this for us human beings living in such trying and difficult times. I believe that, of course, ultimately, consciousness will have the final say. But it is for us, while we have consciousness in this life, this great, great gift to use it in order to understand what it means to live consciously, to live fully with awareness, to know where we're coming and where we're going. Thank you.